Hey plant lovers, welcome back. Today we're talking about something that happens to almost every orchid owner. And what I discovered while researching it will completely change the way you see your plant. Not just how you care for it, what you actually believe it is. Picture this. It's a Sunday morning, maybe 8 o'clock, and the light is coming in at that low golden angle through your living room window. You walk past the shelf where your orchid has been living for the past 2 years. It's been in bloom the whole time. Those long, arching spikes loaded with flowers, deep purple and white, almost too perfect to be real. And then one morning, you notice it. The flowers are gone. The spike is bare, just a thin green stem with a few dried, papery husks where the blooms used to be. And the whole plant looks smaller somehow, quieter. You think, what happened? Did I do something wrong? Is it dying? Here's what's wild. That moment, that bare spike, that sudden silence, is not a warning sign. It's the opposite. And I find what it's actually telling you absolutely extraordinary. Most people own an orchid for years and never understand this moment. They see the bare spike and they panic. They move the plant. They change the watering. Some of them throw it away. Not once do they stop to ask what the plant is actually doing, and why this specific moment is one of the most meaningful things an orchid can communicate about your home. So the question isn't just why your orchid stopped blooming. It's what it means that it stopped. Here, now, in your space, with you. And here's what's wild. The spiritual explanation and the scientific one arrive at the exact same conclusion, from completely different paths. But before we dive in, hit that like and subscribe, because what's coming is going to blow your mind. Let's talk about what the orchid actually is before we talk about what it's doing. In everyday life, the orchid is almost a cliché. You see it in grocery store checkout lines, on hotel lobby counters, on the desks of dentist offices across America. It's one of the best-selling houseplants in the country. Over 100 million are sold in the United States every single year. It's everywhere. It survives almost anything. And yet, when it blooms, really blooms, when those flowers open fully and hold for weeks and weeks, and then when it stops, most people have no idea what that arc actually means. They've been treating one of the most extraordinary organisms on Earth like a piece of seasonal decor. The orchid's bloom cycle is one of the most intelligent biological performances in the plant kingdom. The fact that it pauses is not a failure. It is a deliberate choice. And here's the part that gets me. There are people who've owned the same orchid for 20, 25 years and watched it go through this cycle dozens of times and still feel a small jolt of worry every time the flowers drop. And there are people who bought one 18 months ago and, because they understood what the silence meant, saw it rebloom twice. Already. I'll tell you something that's going to surprise you. Both the spiritual explanation and the scientific one point to the exact same conclusion, just from completely different paths. But to understand it, we need to start with what wisdom traditions have been saying for generations. Let's begin in the American South, specifically in the parishes of Louisiana, Iberville, Ascension, Pointe Coupee, and in the low country of South Carolina and coastal Georgia, where certain African American families maintained plant traditions that had been carried forward from West Africa over centuries. These families kept orchids long before they were fashionable. Not the phalaenopsis you find at Home Depot today. They kept epidendrum and brassavola species, which grew wild in Florida and the Caribbean, and traveled north with people who knew what they were. In these communities, an orchid going quiet after bloom was called, in some families, the plant going home. It was not mourned. It was watched. There was a woman in Plaquemine Parish, Louisiana. She was in her early 80s when she was interviewed for a regional folk botany project in 2009, and she had been keeping orchids since the 1950s. She had one plant that had been in her family since her grandmother's time. She said, "When it stops, you don't touch it. You leave it alone and you pay attention. It knows something you don't yet. She described a pattern she had watched over 50 years. In 1987, she remembered the year clearly, her orchid dropped its blooms in August, which was unusual. 2 months later, her youngest son got a job offer that brought him back to Louisiana after 12 years away. The family was together for the first time in over a decade. The orchid rebloomed in November. She wasn't making a causal claim. She was noting a coincidence she had seen enough times that she had stopped calling it a coincidence. What these communities documented, across generations, was not superstition, it was observation. The plant going quiet signaled a threshold. Something in the household was shifting. And what followed the silence, when the conditions were right, was a return. And that return, they said, always meant something good was consolidating itself in the home. Now let's go further back, to the tropical forests of Southeast Asia, specifically the lowland rainforests of Borneo, Sumatra, and the Philippines, which are among the native habitats of the Phalaenopsis orchid, the most common household variety. In the Dayak communities of Borneo and the Batak people of northern Sumatra, wild orchids growing on the trunks of large trees were considered living records of a place. They marked which trees were old enough, stable enough, and healthy enough to support them. When a cultivated orchid in the home went silent, it was read as the plant entering what some translators have described as its listening period. The Batak had a specific concept, loosely translated as the breath being held, for the resting state of a flowering plant. It was not death. It was the deepest kind of attention. In their understanding, the plant was gathering information, reading the air, the light, the mood of the people in the space, and only when it was satisfied, only when it had confirmed that conditions were safe, would it choose to display again. In these traditions, the moment of reblooming was not just celebrated, it was recorded. Elders kept informal records of when household orchids bloomed and when they did not. And the patterns they tracked across generations were patterns of household stability, of marriages, of returns from long journeys, of the settling of disputes. The ritual when a bloom cycle began again was simple, specific. No elaborate ceremony. The head of the household would hold the pot briefly, both hands underneath it, and say a short phrase of gratitude. Not to the plant, through it. The plant, in their understanding, was an intermediary between the household and something larger. Its decision to bloom again was a message of endorsement. The Tohono O'odham people of the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona had a different but resonant relationship with the concept of a plant's silence. Though the orchid is not native to their desert territory, the Tohono O'odham had deep traditions around all plants that flowered on cycles, understanding the pause between blooming as equally meaningful as the bloom itself. When orchids came into their world through trade and contact with other communities, they interpreted their resting period within this existing framework. One elder, speaking to ethnobotanist Gary Paul Nabhan in the early 1990s, described the resting plant simply: when it is quiet, it is listening harder than when it is loud. Those two sentences contain something remarkable, because what's fascinating is that this observation, made without microscopes or laboratory equipment, aligns exactly with what plant biologists confirmed decades later about what orchids are actually doing during their resting phase. We'll come back to that. The Tohono O'odham teaching around cyclical plants was practical as much as spiritual. The silence was a signal to the caretaker to pay closer attention, not to the flower, but to everything around it. Light, temperature, what was changing in the environment. The plant, in this view, was a sensor. Its resting was its way of saying, something in this system is about to shift. Watch carefully. In feng shui, the orchid holds a specific and honored position. Unlike many houseplants that are valued primarily for their energy clearing or protective qualities, the orchid is associated with refinement, fertility, and what practitioners call pure yang energy: active, generative, expressive. Its flowers are considered a manifestation of the household's capacity to produce, to generate beauty, abundance, and positive relationships. Feng Shui practitioners in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and among diaspora communities across the United States pay close attention to where an orchid is placed and what its bloom cycle communicates about that zone. An orchid blooming near the entrance of a home signals that the household is radiating outward, that positive energy is flowing through the front door in both directions. One placed in the living room, blooming fully, suggests the social energy of the family is at a peak. In the home office, bloom means productive momentum. In the bedroom, it carries associations with intimacy and new beginnings. But here is what most people don't discuss when they talk about feng shui and orchids. The resting phase is not treated as a negative omen. It is treated as a signal of transition. The plant is not withdrawing energy from the space, it is redistributing it. It is, in the language of feng shui, moving energy from expression to consolidation, from the outward to the inward, from performance to preparation. The teaching is, do not force a resting orchid. Do not repot it in panic. Do not flood it with fertilizer. Do not move it to a new location. The plant is doing internal work. It is deciding whether to renew its investment in this space. And your job as the caretaker is to demonstrate, through consistent and calm care, that the space is worth that investment. What's interesting is that feng shui doesn't contradict science here. It complements it in a way that I find absolutely extraordinary. And that's exactly what we're going to explore now. If this is already shifting how you see your orchid, hit that like button right now. That one gesture tells the platform this content matters, and it allows me to keep going deep on topics like this. Now comes the scientific part, and I promise, when you hear it, everything is going to make sense. The Phalaenopsis orchid is what botanists call a sympodial bloomer with a determinate flowering spike, which sounds complicated, but the plain English version is this. It builds energy toward one specific performance, executes it fully, and then stops. Not because something went wrong, because that is the design. That is the intelligence of the organism. Here's the analogy that helped me understand it. Think of a world-class athlete preparing for a single competition. For months, all of their energy goes into training, building, storing, getting ready. The competition lasts a few hours, and then they rest. They don't run the marathon again the next day. The body that just performed at its peak needs time to repair, reload, and prepare to perform again. What looks like inactivity from the outside is intense biological work on the inside. That is exactly what your orchid is doing. Researchers at the University of Florida's Environmental Horticulture Department have studied the Phalaenopsis bloom-rest cycle extensively. Their work, along with supporting research from Texas A&M AgriLife Extension's Ornamental Horticulture Division, has confirmed something that was once considered counterintuitive. The quality and duration of an orchid's next bloom cycle is directly determined by the quality of its current resting phase. Not by what you do during bloom, by what happens after. Dr. Terry Starman, an ornamental horticulture specialist at Texas A&M, has emphasized in her published work that the resting orchid is in active photosynthetic mode. It is producing and storing carbohydrates in its pseudobulbs and fleshy roots, building the reserves it will need for the next spike. The silence is not absence of activity. It is a different kind of activity. Underground activity. Internal investment. Here's the principle that changes everything. There is a concept in biology, and I want to explain this clearly because it sounds technical, but it's actually elegant, called hormic stress response. The simple version: moderate environmental challenge activates extraordinary biological response. Not damage, not comfort. The middle zone, just enough difficulty, triggers the organism's most powerful adaptive behaviors. For an orchid, the trigger for reblooming is a specific kind of stress, not neglect, not abuse. A deliberate, calibrated shift in conditions, specifically a drop in nighttime temperature of between 10 and 15 degrees Fahrenheit for a period of 4 to 6 weeks. This temperature differential signals to the plant's cellular hormone system that a seasonal transition has occurred. In the wild, in Borneo, that signal would mean the dry season is ending, pollinators are coming, now is the time. That hormone is cytokinin, a growth signaling compound that, when triggered by this thermal shift, redirects the orchid's stored carbohydrate reserves from root maintenance into spike initiation. The energy was sitting in the roots. The roots sent it upward, and within 6 to 8 weeks, a new spike begins to emerge. This is the energy redirect moment. The plant was using its resources to maintain itself. The temperature signal told it, the environment has shifted. Invest outward. And it did. Cornell Cooperative Extension's Master Gardener program has published guides noting that in most American homes, this natural temperature differential can occur near a window in autumn and early winter, when daytime heat from sunlight creates warm conditions and the cold glass at night drops the ambient temperature around the plant. It happens naturally. You may not have been managing it consciously, but your orchid was feeling it. Do you see what this means? The orchid's silence, that period of quiet that worried you, was the plant gathering everything it had, consolidating its resources, reading its environment, and then waiting for a specific signal that conditions were right to invest again. When the signal came, it didn't hesitate. It bloomed. Every single culture we talked about described this, in different words, with different rituals, from different continents. They were all describing the same biological reality. Ancient traditions said the quiet plant was listening, that it was gathering information about the household before deciding to invest itself again. Feng Shui said the resting orchid was moving from expression to consolidation, redistributing energy from the outward to the inward, preparing to renew its investment. Science says the orchid during its resting phase is building carbohydrate reserves in its roots and pseudobulbs, waiting for a temperature trigger that signals a safe window for reproductive output. They are all describing the same thing, just in different languages. The common thread is this: the orchid does not bloom randomly. It blooms when conditions, environmental, thermal, energetic, meet a specific threshold of stability and readiness. What every tradition is pointing to, and what the biology confirms, is that the bloom is a response to a cared-for environment. It is the plant's declaration that this place, this light, this temperature, this attention is worth it. Two different paths, one identical truth. Now I know you've been waiting for this part. The first factor is light. And here's what most people miss. It's not just about how much light your orchid gets, it's about the quality and direction of it. Phalaenopsis orchids evolved in the filtered canopy light of tropical rainforests, where direct sunlight never reaches the forest floor. In most American homes, an east-facing window is ideal. Bright, indirect morning light, gentle enough not to burn the leaves, strong enough to fuel photosynthesis through the long resting phase. A sheer curtain in front of a south-facing window works well too, especially in states like Ohio, Illinois, and the Pacific Northwest, where winter light is weaker. What many people don't know is that the light requirement actually changes between the active growing phase and the resting phase. During rest, you can reduce light slightly. The plant doesn't need to fuel flowering. What it needs is consistency. The second factor is temperature differential. And this is the one that changes everything. As we talked about in the science section, without a drop in nighttime temperature of 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 to 6 consecutive weeks, most Phalaenopsis orchids will not initiate a new bloom spike. In most American homes, this happens naturally near a window between October and January. The glass cools the air around the plant at night, while daytime solar gain keeps things warm. If your home is heavily insulated or climate-controlled at a constant temperature year-round, which is increasingly common, you may need to facilitate this yourself. Move the orchid closer to a window at night in autumn. Or move it to a room that naturally cools down, like a sunroom or an enclosed porch. Target range: nighttime temperatures between 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit for that 4 to 6 week window. The third factor is watering rhythm, and the mistake here is almost universal. More orchids die from overwatering than from any other single cause. In their native habitat, Phalaenopsis orchids grow attached to the bark of trees, not in soil. Their roots are designed to absorb water rapidly during a rainstorm and then dry out completely. They expect wetness followed by complete dryness. In practice, water thoroughly once a week. Let the water run out the drainage holes. Never let the pot sit in standing water. And then let the medium dry out almost completely before watering again. The easiest test: lift the pot. When it feels light, water. When it feels heavy, wait. During the resting phase, reduce watering frequency slightly. Every 10 to 14 days is plenty. The fourth factor is fertilizer, and specifically, the timing of it. Most orchid owners fertilize during bloom or during visible growth. That is backwards. The most important time to fertilize is during the resting phase. When the plant is building the reserves it will use to power the next spike. A balanced orchid fertilizer with equal nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Look for a 20-20-20 formula, available at most Lowe's and Home Depot locations. Diluted to half strength, applied once every 2 weeks during the resting period. Stop fertilizing when the new spike appears, and through the duration of bloom. Let the plant use what it has stored. The fifth factor is the pot and the medium. This one is overlooked almost completely. Most orchids arrive in clear plastic nursery pots, and those clear pots are not decorative laziness. They serve a function. Orchid roots contain chlorophyll. They photosynthesize. They need light. Repotting into an opaque ceramic or terracotta pot, which feels more polished on your shelf, can reduce root health over time. If you want an attractive display, place the clear plastic pot inside a decorative outer container. Do not repot your orchid unless the roots are visibly rotting or the bark medium has broken down into dust, which typically happens every 18 to 24 months. When you do repot, use orchid-specific bark medium, not potting soil. Most Lowe's and independent garden centers carry it. And the final factor, the one nobody wants to hear, is patience. The resting phase of a Phalaenopsis orchid can last anywhere from 3 to 6 months, sometimes longer. During that time, nothing visible is happening, but everything important is. The plant is rebuilding. It is deciding. It is listening to its environment and making a calculation about whether conditions are stable enough to invest in another bloom. There is something almost philosophical about that. The things in life that produce the most extraordinary results rarely do so on demand. You create the right conditions, you maintain them consistently, and then you wait. The orchid doesn't respond to urgency, it responds to steadiness. And when it's ready, when it has decided that this environment, this light, this temperature, this attention has earned it, the spike will appear. Usually from the base of the plant, from between 2 leaves, just a small green nub at first. And you will barely believe what you are seeing. But I promise you, when you see that stalk emerge, everything will have been worth it. The bloom of a Phalaenopsis orchid, when it finally comes, lasts between 2 and 4 months. That's long by flower standards, but it does end. The flowers drop, the colors fade, the spike goes bare again. It is temporary. But the fact that it happens at all, that this plant which can survive neglect and bad light and inconsistent watering, decides one day to use everything it has stored to create something that beautiful, that says something. And here's what I want you to sit with. You created that environment. You placed it near the right window. You let it be dry between waterings. You gave it the temperature variation it needed, even if you didn't know that's what you were doing. Whether you understood the biology or not, you created the conditions, and the plant responded. There is something in that worth applying beyond your windowsill. The people, the projects, the relationships that bloom. They don't do it in spite of periods of quiet and withdrawal. They do it because of them. The silence isn't failure, it is preparation. It is the deepest kind of attention being paid to whether the conditions are right to give everything again. Stillness is not the absence of growth. It is what growth looks like from the inside. Has your orchid ever stopped blooming and come back? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Take care of your plant.